This video is about introducing secondary sources, and we'll be using secondary sources as we work on our writing assignment for Dracula. Be sure that as we go through this video or afterwards, you fill in your notes template and submit it to Canvas. So in order to understand what a secondary source is, we first have to know what a primary source is. So going here, a primary source, at least for our discussions in English class, is an original creative writing or a work of art of some kind. In our case, we're going to be using Dracula by Bram Stoker, but we could also be using a poem, or we could be using a short story, a piece of artwork, anything that would be the original work. Next is the secondary source, and this applies to any class that you're ever going to be in. A secondary source analyzes and interprets the primary source, or it interprets the creative work. So the secondary sources that we're going to be looking at are essentially very formal essays, just like the ones you guys have been writing for Macbeth or for Beowulf or for Frankenstein. And in this example, I have an essay analyzing and interpreting Dracula. It's called The Importance of Blood During the Victorian Era, Blood as Sexual Signifier in Dracula. So notice that I've used these quotation marks because it's technically an essay, and it's written by a person who is analyzing this primary source, Dracula. So eventually you're going to be asked to use both a primary and a secondary source. Your job is to imagine it as a conversation between your interpretation of the primary source, or your interpretation of Dracula, and then someone else's interpretation that you read about in the secondary source. And you have a couple things you could do. You could compare, you could contrast, you could also figure out a way to be both of them at the same time, and that's going to be the conversation that you have between your interpretation and the secondary source authors. Second bullet point, in addition to your own quote and your own analysis of that primary source, just like any other essay you've ever written, you're going to provide a quote from the secondary source, and here's what you're going to do for it. Explain what the author says in that quote in your own words, and then explain how that quote compares to or contrasts your own ideas. That could also be, it's somewhere in the middle. So let's take a bird's eye view on the order of things in order to put those primary and secondary sources into conversation. First is to read the primary source. Great, we're working on reading Dracula, we've got it. Your next job is to get an idea of that specific thesis for it. What is Dracula about? What's the message? How is it going to answer the prompt that you have for your writing assignment? Second is to read the secondary source, and that's where you figure out what the author's overall argument is. So what is he or she saying about the primary source? This is essentially identifying the author's thesis. Then you pick out passages from the secondary source that compare or contrast to your ideas and your specific thesis for the primary source. So going back to how they compare contrast to step one. Then finally, you'll narrow down your choices so that you have, the one or two or three, whatever your assignment may be, that best help you make your own argument. Which ones are the best points of comparison or the best points of contrast? So this is going to be a slide that you might want to save for when you're actually doing the writing, or know that you can come back to this notes template anytime that you need to. Introducing a secondary source, what they say, requires you to be really clear about who says it and what he or she says. So below here I have some sentence frames that you can come back to anytime. Relatively simple stuff like, in his or her essay, whatever the title is, X, that's the author, maintains that, here you've got your quote. X, the author's name, agrees or disagrees in the essay blank when he or she states, blah, blah, blah. And then X's essay, whatever, complicates the matter of whatever it might be when they write. Notice that you're still using the exact same strategies that you've been using for integrating and citing quotations. The only difference is that now you're citing these essays as secondary sources instead of just your primary source. This would be the I say part. So this is where you figure out that conversation that you're having with the secondary source. Do you disagree with it? Then you might want to use something like this. The essence of the argument is, however, and then for example would go into your own quote from the primary source and your own analysis. Do you agree? Well, in making this comment, blah, blah, blah says, and similarly, notice that now you use your own analysis and your own quote from the primary source. here would be somewhere in the middle, right? Accurately recognizes that blank, yet he or she neglects the idea. Now you figure out your quotes and your analyses. Notice that these frames also make use of really good transition words. So in the disagree part, we have the however here, right? Showing the contrast between the two ideas. For agree, we have similarly, which shows a comparison between the two. And then here in the third one, we're somewhere in the middle, we have that big yet, right? That big fanboy's word that's going to show that there's a big shift or a big difference between what I just said and what I'm about to say. We'll talk a little more about transition words and how they can help you figure out this conversation between the primary and the secondary source. I think it would be great for you to stop the video here and take a minute to read through this example. So I've given you the specific thesis of the essay. It goes back to Beowulf. The specific thesis is that Grendel and his mother live out both predator and human-like qualities in the epic poem Beowulf. And then I read through this whole secondary source, and here is the passage that I've chosen to use from the secondary source. Go ahead and pause here, take a minute to read through it and kind of digest it for a second. Now that you've looked at the thesis and the passage from the secondary source, we're going to take a look at an actual paragraph that uses both a primary and a secondary source. What I would suggest is for you to do two things. First is to read through the paragraph, and then second is to highlight the primary source info in the first color that you choose and the secondary source info in the second choice or in the second color that you choose. Figure out where it is that conversation's happening and how the author of this paragraph can switch between the primary and the second source just like you would in a normal conversation. Here's the color coding that I've put together for this example. So you'll notice that in red I have the secondary source and in blue I have the primary source. So I start with my topic sentence. While Grendel and his mother are monstrous and demon-like, certain aspects of their characterization show that they are, in fact, a blend of the bestial and the human. So notice that I've done a couple things. I've shown in my topic sentence what I'm going to be doing with the primary and secondary sources. So I am going to acknowledge that Grendel and his mother are monstrous and demon-like I see in the secondary source. However, and there's kind of my transition word, right, that while, their aspects of their characterization show that they're, in fact, this blend of the bestial and the human. So indicating to my reader that even though the secondary source says this, I see this in the primary source. I see the blend, and that's what I'm proving. Then notice that I have this big transition word here, right? So that's showing the difference between my idea in the primary source and the secondary source's idea. Here's all the red. So in his essay, blah, blah, blah. And then I have this quotation that's actually from the secondary source. It is not from Beowulf at all. It's the secondary source's quote. And then he also suggests blah, 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 continuing on with more from that secondary source. Here's again my transition word. Yet a close reading of that translation of Beowulf shows complexities in Grendel, right? Now I'm going into my own ideas, and I'm citing and quoting specifically from Beowulf, from my poem of Beowulf. Similarly, there's another transition word that's just continuing my idea of this primary source. When Beowulf grabs blah, 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 here's another quotation that comes straight from Beowulf. Before I switch back into the red, notice that I must have a transition word. So anytime that we switch, there has to be some kind of a transition word. Here we have, although there's no doubt that the poet's sympathies lie with humans, blah, 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 as this secondary source author indicates, a close reading of the poem demonstrates that Grendel is a combination. Notice how I'm repeating this topic sentence to close out my paragraph, and then leaving the reader with a good closing idea that expands that paragraph. Perhaps the ability of the reader or listener of the poem to recognize these traits in Grendel makes him all the more frightening, since the reader or listener might see similar traits in himself. Notice that that gets us really close to a general thesis, right? Maybe we could add something more like that up here in the topic sentence, but I am really happy with the way that this author of the paragraph rounds out the end of the body paragraph with a connection to not only the topic sentence, but also the general thesis. So that's all I've got for you in this video. Of course, if you have any questions, send me an email or come find me at school. Be sure you finish up your notes template with all the labeling of primary and secondary sources, and then we'll do some more practice in class together.